This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting the show today is Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel with a cattle market update. He discusses the cattle on feed report as well as factors that are affecting slaughter cow values. K-State Extension Farm Management Specialist Gregg Ibendahl continues the show by discussing his net farm income projections for 2023 and 2024. Joe Gerken, K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist, rounds out today's show. He explains how riparian buffers can be beneficial for ponds and agriculture. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update. And this week, we're joined with Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
You bet. Good to be here.
For the cattle market, starting off with, what is cash cattle market looking like?
Cattle markets are obviously very strong. We're at nearly record levels, across the board for feeder cattle, fed cattle. And they're, they're kind of holding in there. Feeder cattle, you might expect to see some seasonal weakness in the fall. We're certainly not seeing that yet. And the auction totals would suggest that we're getting into the fall run of calves, if you will. The volumes are up seasonally for sure. So, but these markets just continue very strong. And is that a continued thought then for the futures? I think it is. We're moving into tighter and tighter numbers. We think this thing has a long ways to go. On a longer term basis, we're looking for evidence that we've started saving heifers, trying to rebuild this herd from the levels that we've been drawn down to. We don't see any indication of that yet. So, and I don't really think it's going to happen in a big way this fall. We may start a little bit, but we're probably talking about things that are really going to take place in the coming, 2 to 4 years. And so are we seeing any changes then in box beef cutout? Box beef cutout dropped down after the pre-Labor Day, purchases, if you will. But it looks like it's kind of bottomed again. It got back down choice box beef around that $3 mark. Now it's kind of stabilized, picked back up a little bit. So, it seems to be holding pretty steady. And that was kind of the range it was in through the summer, if you will, prior to that last grilling season purchasing spree. But so I think it's holding very steady at this point in time. Derrell, it seems like the word kind of for the cattle markets right now is steady. And do you think it's going to stay that way as we look forward? I think so. We're moving forward. Again, we're in this very tight supply and getting tighter kind of a situation. These markets are going to continue very strong. I don't look for very much probably less than usual seasonality. So I mentioned feeder cattle, especially the calf market typically is lower in the fall for that in conjunction with that fall run of calves. I don't think we're going to see that much pressure on these prices this fall. Cull cows, kind of the same story. We typically market the calves and then cull cows in the fall and put in a seasonal low. I don't think we're going to see much of that seasonal pressure this year just because the underlying numbers are so tight. And talking about a few more numbers, the National Agricultural Statistics Service from the USDA just recently released their cattle on feed report. And so what numbers are you seeing in there? Yeah, the latest USDA monthly cattle on feed report for September showed that, placements in the month of August were about 95% of last year. Marketings were 94% of last year. And the September 1 on feed total is 98% of last year, down 2%. For the most part, this report was pretty well anticipated. The placements were maybe just a tick higher than some people thought, but it was within the range of estimates. So I don't think it's a big surprise, really. The overall comment I would make is that we are, continuing to see what we've been seeing, which is a very slow tightening of these cattle on feed numbers. We're still only down 2% on a year-over-year basis, but we continue to, work our way a little bit lower as we go forward. Not planning on seeing any impact from this cattle on feed report in the cattle markets? I don't think we'll see a lot of reaction in the market. Again, you never know. Sometimes you get a sleeper kind of reaction to it, but I really don't think so. I don't think there's any big surprise here. Some people will look at that marketing number and say, well, that's a pretty low number, but we know cattle numbers are tight, and we've been seeing cattle slaughter decrease. So again, it's not a surprise. It's just the reality of the situation that we're in right now.
Derrell, moving to discuss some recent articles you wrote for Oklahoma State University Extension's Cow-Calf Corner newsletter, this one being from September 18th, discussing factors affecting slaughter cow values. And within that, Derrell, Oklahoma auctions saw higher than average prices.
Yeah, the cull cow market has moved higher this year, just like all the other cattle markets. So we've got these cull cows at, boning cull cow, so kind of in a middle of the road cull cow right now is bringing about $1.08 to $1.10, depending on their dressing percentage. And so they're at very, very lofty levels. Breaking cows, which will be the younger, fatter cows typically, bringing above that. And if they come in really lean right now, then they'll bring a little bit less than that. But all of these are at elevated levels.
Talking about auctions and then also talking about slaughter, those numbers are down from pretty high highs we had in 2022.
Yeah, we had record beef production in 2022. That was based on slaughter, which was driven by the drought liquidation that we had. So we were sort of pulling inventories down and pulling cattle forward because, we marketed calves early and so on. Now we're seeing, steer slaughters down, heifer slaughters down some, but not that much yet. That's the slowest one to come down. Beef cow slaughter is down significantly so far this year, about 13%. Dairy cow slaughter is the only class of cattle that's actually up on a year-over-year basis. So you have to look over into the dairy market to kind of explain that. But when you look at the beef part of it per se, in terms of the various classes of cattle, we're down across the board. Year to date, total cattle slaughter is down about 3.9% for the year so far.
Would producers possibly want to leave that cull cow with a bull because there's a potential for a better price down the road?
Yeah, it's a time of year when we're going to be marketing cull cows, and there's a couple things that producers might consider. They are worth a lot in pretty much any stage that you find them right now, because of the way the market typically moves. Now, I said earlier, I don't think we'll see as much seasonal pressure this fall, but to the extent that we are a little bit lower seasonally, if you hang on to them after culling, feed them, and put some weight back on them, you'll sell more pounds for more money typically from from about a November low into the first part of the next year. You might raise them, depending on how much weight they gain, you might raise them up a grade in terms of their classification, and they'll bring even more money. And then, on top of that, we're moving into a very tight breeding cow market situation. And so if you leave a bull with those cows while you're feeding them and putting a little weight on them, and, some of them very likely will get pregnant. Maybe they fell out of your herd because they didn't get bred on time or stay in with the rest of the herd. But if a cow gets bred over the winter, you could probably sell her next spring for even more money.
So maybe taking some time to run some numbers and see if it's financially worth it, which way works best then for your operation?
That's exactly right. And a lot of it comes down to sort of the details of, if you're going to keep those cows, then you got to be able to take care of them. So there's management and resource considerations. Do you have the feed? Some producers may have some excess feed. Cows are a pretty good way to utilize some sort of moderate quality hay. Maybe you got some leftover hay that's not the best quality. You'll have to have a little supplement to go with them. But, cows can utilize that lower quality hay, and that's a good way to add value back into some of those medium to lower quality hays.
And continuing to expand our cattle market conversation, talking a little bit about imports and exports now. And imports are something that North America does a fair amount of.
Yeah, we have a very integrated market in general in North America between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. in terms of both beef and cattle. And I recently took a little bit deeper look into the live cattle part of that. Both Canada and Mexico are net exporters of cattle to the U.S., or we're net importers, if you will, of live cattle. Feeder cattle from Mexico. We get slaughter and feeder cattle, as well as cull cows and bulls from Canada. And so those are part of the flows. And again, it's kind of related to that broader integrated market that we have for beef flowing both ways. And we do export some cattle to Canada and Mexico as well. So there's flows both directions.
As we think about the full cattle market, Derrell, what are a few things you'd like to tell cattle producers?
We've got nearly record high prices right now. Producers are enjoying that. It's still important to do a couple things. One is you still want to market cattle. So, we've got time this fall. maybe precondition those calves, put some additional value in those calves. Even though they're worth a lot, you always want to try to get the most you can out of them. So you might evaluate preconditioning programs. We talked about marketing cull cows. There's some opportunities there potentially. And the other thing I would mention is that, just because we've got a strong trending market and a lot of expectations for continued higher prices, I don't think I would completely ignore risk management. And so as we think ahead to, whatever phases of cattle production that you're in right now, you certainly don't want to rule out the idea, at least of some sort of disaster level coverage, if you will, because outside factors could affect the market, even though we think the market fundamentals internally are very strong in the cattle market.
And Derrell, if people would like to read more of your Cow-Calf Corner newsletters, where can they do that?
The easiest way is just send me an email at derrell.peel@okstate.edu. We'd be happy to share the Cow-Calf Corner newsletter. I write that along with some of my animal science colleagues, and we are pretty happy with and pretty proud of the marketing and management and production information that we put out each week.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and sharing with us our cattle market update.
You bet. I'm happy to do it.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. In today's show notes on agtoday.net, you'll be able to find Derrell's email, which is derrell.peel@okstate.edu. There will also be a link to the Oklahoma State University Cow-Calf newsletter. Included in that then will also be the Cattle on Feed report from the National Agricultural Statistics Service. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by Kansas State University Extension Farm Management Specialist Gregg Ibendahl as he discusses his recent work on net farm income projections for 2023 and 2024. We're now cutting to that short break. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now discussing net farm income projections for 2023 and 2024. And then to talk about it, we have K-State Extension Farm Management Specialist Gregg Ibendahl. Gregg, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
So talking about net farm income projections, you posted this on agmanager.info, and it's actually an update from a February projection.
Yeah, normally we try to do the net farm income forecast probably 3 or 4 times during the year because, obviously things change as the course of the year. So when I was first doing this forecast back in February, we were still very early in the year. We didn't know what kind of situation the drought was going to hold, really what a lot of the farm expenses were going to be, and what was happening with grain prices. So now we're pretty much at least 2/3 through the year right now. So we have a pretty good idea, at least especially for wheat. We know what the yields are going to be. We have about 8 or 9 months of prices now, and I have actually a pretty good idea of what yields are going to be for the summer crops based on some yield projections that I have. And at this time, we also know what the government payments for last year are going to be that they get paid this year. So I have a pretty good feel for what's really going to happen with net farm income at this point in time, whereas in February I really didn't. It was pretty much a guess at that point in time.
And Gregg, we'll kind of talk through what you're predicting to go. But first, before we do that, giving a little bit of background about these projections and what farms are included in it.
Well, to make my forecast model a little simpler and so I don't have to expand on too many farms, I really concentrate on our KFMA grain farms. So the KFMA, Kansas Farm Management Association data is really the backbone that goes into this, as well as looking at my projection for prices and yields. But I use the KFMA data to get a lot of the expenses from.
What's your process about then coming to all these concluded projections?
So basically, we take that data and we have a pretty good idea of what things are going to be. So we basically plug that into a model, and I can look at really what I think is going to happen with net farm income for the coming year. So like I said, we have an idea for prices and yields at this point in time. We use 2022 KFMA farms really to get an idea for the expenses. I kind of update those based on what has happened during the year. So I have an idea what happened last year with fertilizer, obviously, but as the year goes on, I have a new projection I can plug in the current fertilizer prices to see how that paid out. I also have to accommodate for the fact that there could be some idea of farmers buying their expenses earlier and then maybe not expensing it till next year. Farmers doing cash-based accounting, they can really buy stuff earlier and then account it in this year where it may not show up really from an accrual perspective in the next year. So looking at those kind of things, that's how I kind of go about getting all the expenses in and kind of updating my model as I go.
So for 2023 net farm income projections, how is September's different than February's?
Well, I think I was pretty pessimistic back in February. I think I still showed an overall average profit, but it has since really kind of increased increased quite a bit. So, there's been a few bad things happen during the course of the year. Certainly grain prices have went down over what I first thought they were going to be. But that's really kind of counter offset by the fact that I think crop insurance payments are going to probably be higher than what they would have originally because of those lower grain prices. So I factor that in there. I also factor in what the yields are going to be. So yields are probably going to be a little higher than what we first thought. The wheat yield didn't actually turn out to be quite as bad as what they thought. I think we ended up with about 32 to 35 yield for the state. Now, again, that's a lot of wheat acres didn't get harvested, so we have a better idea for that. And then I have a final number for the crop insurance numbers too. So there are going to be some payouts if you have the right kind of base anyway out in western Kansas, especially for corn. So that kind of helps out in the revenue side. Really, the revenue side hasn't really declined that much over what I first saw. I think the big benefit actually is expenses have gone down quite a bit over what they were first projected to be. At one point last fall, I think, fertilizer for anhydrous was like $1,500 a ton. Really it's probably less than half that now. Now, the big question is how much of that improvement in fertilizer is actually going to show up this year. I know a lot of farmers probably bought their spring fertilizer back last fall, but there's still going to be some farms, I think, that took advantage of that, especially for the wheat production this fall. I think farmers are going to see some advantage if they apply fertilizer to get that going. So there is going to be some cost reduction this year. Again, some of that may not really show up till next year, but when you take the combination of the fact that we had probably pretty even revenue for this year compared to last year with the fact that expenses are going down, I think we're definitely going to see an improvement in that regard. And even though I don't have very many livestock farms in my mix, I'm basically just looking at the KFMA grain farms. There is some livestock farms that show up in those mix, and really there's a big improvement on the livestock side, so that'll help as well. I think the overall picture is we're probably looking at better net farm income this year than we had last year.
So what is that number you're kind of expecting for 2023 net farm income?
Well, I think I'm looking at probably about an average of about $150,000 to $70,000 or so, depending if you're talking about the median or the mean value. Again, there's a little difference between how you calculate those. Some of the better farms tend to bring up our average. But really, last year, this 2022 wasn't a total disaster. I mean, it may look that way if you look at it over the last 5 to 7 years, but really from a historical perspective, you go back and look at 20 years, really 2022 net farm income was probably above average. I think this year in 2023 will be above that. So really an improvement for most farms. If I look at the number of farms that actually probably have negative net farm income, which is really what we're kind of looking at the tails of our distribution. Really in 2022, we probably had about 10% of our farms that had negative net farm income. I really think in 2023, we're probably looking at a very similar case, so not too many farms that are going to be in trouble. Really an overall improvement. Now, the situation certainly gets different when we get to 2024.
And first, mentioning on those numbers with the mean and median, there's a wide variety of production across Kansas, so that's just the average or your guess of the average.
Yeah, like I said in the paper, we have about 500 plus farms that make up this, I use in this database I developed this net farm income projection from. And there's certainly a very wide distribution of what net farm income is going to be. Certainly we're going to have some farms that are probably going to have negative profits, but some farms are going to do really, really well. So when you take the average, those top farms, they tend to raise up what the median farm would be. Again, the median farm would be like the 50th percentile level where half the farms are higher than that, half the farms are lower. Well, those farms on the very top end that have really outstanding net farm incomes, they tend to bring the average up higher. So really in most years when I look at our KFMA data, really the average value is higher than what the median value is.
Looking really far ahead then to net farm income projections for 2024, Greg.
Well, I kind of feel like the weatherman when I get to that point in time because there's so much unknown at that point. We have no idea what the weather. Well, we haven't even harvested this year's crop yet, so I'm asked to make projections about a crop we don't even have in the ground yet when the previous one's still out in the field. So again, I'm kind of assuming for 2024 that we do have normal weather, normal yields. Again, who knows in Kansas if that's going to be the case. I'm using the futures market as a projection for prices. And again, the futures market's, I think, a little bit on the pessimistic side. They're kind of taking what the current prices are and kind of projecting those out for the next year or two. So that, that could easily change. I don't have any expectations of any extra crop insurance or government payments at that point. And when you figure that in, we're probably looking at, expenses won't be much higher. In fact, they may even be a little bit down if you look at the relationship to what was lower fertilizer and herbicide and seed cost and fuel cost for this year, how much that got played in this year versus 2024. So really, I think expenses won't be any higher. But again, the revenue side could be impacted because I think we're probably looking at lower grain prices, and crop insurance probably won't cover that shortfall next year. And again, we don't know what yields are going to be. So really, at this point in time, again, just kind of a best guess, and it really is almost like a guess. I'm like the weatherman. I guess my guess is better than other people's guesses. So I'm really looking at probably maybe a decrease in net farm income for 2024.
So overall, how would you sum up this current updated projection for Kansas producers?
Well, I think it's an improvement for sure. Looking at what's going to happen this year, I think producers are going to see some benefit to the lower expenses. Again, going forward, it's still going to be a profitable year for most farmers. I think I'm looking at right now. Again, this is very, very early, but I'm looking at probably an average or median net farm income, probably about $50,000. That seems low compared to what it has been for the past several years. But really, again, from a historical perspective, it's probably not an outlier, really. It's probably in line with what it has been historically. The only thing that really concerns me long term is the fact that I'm really projecting about 30% of our farms could have negative net farm income. And that gets to be a little concerned because that's a third of our farmers that may not have any profit or zero profit. And the other thing we need to really concern ourselves with, too, is what has been happening with family living. So, farm families are just like any other set of families out there. Your income goes up, you tend to raise family living. Well, if you have a year where income goes down, well, our farm family is really going to adjust their family living to account for that. And I would say that may be a year or two delay before that finally hits home that we need to cut back our spending. But again, farm families are not unique in that. I think any other family in the U.S. could say the same thing.
And Greg, where can people find out this update and maybe look for another one in the year?
Yeah, so you go to agmanager.info. This should be up there on the webpage. Just search under my name and you can find it. I will probably do another before the year is out, or maybe just after the first of the year, do another net farm income forecast.
Greg, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us an update on net farm income for 2023.
All right, well, thanks.
That was K-State Extension Farm Management Specialist Gregg Ibendahl. You can find his work by going to agmanager.info, or I'll also link it in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. His work is titled Revised Net Farm Income Projection for 2023 and 2024 September Update. Also in today's show notes will be links to some upcoming events that are taking place in Manhattan, Kansas this week. The first one's taking place Thursday, September 28th, and it's the K-State Beef Stalker Field Day. It'll be taking place at the K-State Beef Stalker Unit here in Manhattan. The day is going to get started at 9:30 a.m. with registration and will wrap up around 5:30. You can learn more about how to register for this event by following the link in the show notes. Also, in the show notes will be linked to the Kansas Forest Service's Seed to Saw Open House, which is taking place Saturday, September 30th. At this open house, there'll be live demonstrations, tour of the Arboretum and Historic State Office, and educational booths and activities. You can find out more about this event also by going to kansasforest.org/events. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show with information from the Wildlife Department. And today, we're joined with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, today you wanted to talk about riparian buffers. And what is a riparian buffer?
It's a fancy word, but really what it means is we're allowing plants and vegetation to grow up. Riparian means along a waterway, so around a pond or around a stream that is feeding into that pond. And so we're going to allow some native grasses, forbs, to grow up around those areas. And that has a lot of benefits for agriculture and for wildlife, so I thought it'd be fun to talk about.
And talking about some of those benefits, one of them being slowing runoff.
Yeah, and so we've talked about erosion, and that's a factor that we think about in agriculture. Losing that crop ground is something that we want to definitely slow down. And so having water that's flowing over the surface be able to hit some vegetation, the vegetation will slow down that water. The roots will help to stabilize some of that sediment. And over time, you can see significant decreases in the amount of sediment sediment that's eroding into our waterways.
Which is something important then for water quality.
Yeah, so water quality, we talked a lot about ponds filling in with the drought. Now's a good time to clean them out. Anytime that we can slow down that erosion, that's going to be really beneficial. Those plants that are growing up can also take up some of the nutrients that would otherwise end up in the waterways. So nitrogen and phosphorus are the two main ones. So we're going to see those plants growing up instead of getting in the waterway and allowing things like algae to take over. We've talked previously about the importance of water quality and how that helps increase yield in livestock. And so a lot of benefits kind of trickling down. So we're slowing down some of those nutrients, and we can see some economic gains on the back end by improving that water quality.
Something then not only important for cattle, but also for wildlife and pollinators.
A lot of these strips will have beneficial plants in them. And so you'll see things like a lot of different bird species show up. You might see some amphibians, reptiles. You're going to increase your biodiversity a lot of times. There's been some research that shows that if you're building them for economic or agricultural gains, you might not have as much wildlife gains. The flip of that's true as well. If you're establishing these buffers for wildlife specifically, they might decrease in their agricultural gains. But all of them, there's a lot of benefits of having these buffers in place. And so the wildlife's an added benefit.
And people might think that it's actually not beneficial, but it is beneficial for producers.
Sure. A lot of producers, they've been doing things the same way for a long time, or they're hesitant to give up row crop production in favor of establishing some native plants. And that makes sense. What the research shows is that if you establish these buffer strips on the edges of fields or areas, low-lying areas where there might be a lot of aquatic infiltration, so you might have some flooding. There's shade areas of low productivity. What the research has shown is that there's no economic loss in those areas by allowing it to become native grass or have these buffer strips, but there are advantages to having the strips there. So like we talked about with the wildlife, with increasing the water quality. So overall, no net economic loss, but they can have some positive impacts on your farm.
And how do people go about building one of these riparian buffers?
Sure. Well, you can do it with as little effort as you want. I mean, it could be as simple as not farming an area and letting whatever plants want to grow up there. A lot of native grasses could be planted, and so you could plant some native grass strips around your pond. Native forbs would always be great. It doesn't take much effort. I mean, it literally is as easy as kind of letting Mother Nature do her job over time.
Joe, as we're talking about riparian buffers, establishing that riparian buffers and buffer strips aren't the same thing.
Well, they're very similar. And so a riparian buffer is specifically around a water area, so near a stream or near a pond. So there is that specificity of the riparian buffer. Buffer strips are probably something that a lot of listeners have heard of before as well, and those are just areas between different crop fields where we're allowing these native grasses or native forbs to grow up as well. And so there's a lot of similar benefits between both of those. They're very similar in how they benefit. The buffer strips don't tend to hold back or improve the water quality as much as the riparian buffers. So there's a lot of benefits to both. They're very similar. Riparian strips are kind of a specific kind of a buffer strip.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you this Monday on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.